My name is Vorruk Sel, third-class academic observer for the Galactic Cooperative Institute of Sentient Studies, and I want to make one thing absolutely clear before I begin this report. I did not sign up for this. I signed up for a comfortable research position cataloging the mating calls of gas-dwelling polyps on Nevia 6. Soft work, quiet work. The kind of work where nothing tries to eat you and nobody raises their hand during an orientation lecture to ask what the lethal temperature threshold of molten rock is, just out of curiosity. But here I am, sitting in a cramped observation pod, orbiting a planet called Earth, watching through a reinforced viewport as the most baffling species in the known galaxy goes about its day, and I am filing this report with shaking tentacles, because what I witnessed today should not be possible. Not according to any framework of biology, psychology or common sense that the Cooperative has spent 4,000 years building. Let me start from the beginning. The assignment came down 6 standard cycles ago. Our institute had been tasked with evaluating a new batch of candidate species for Cooperative membership. Most of the list was routine, Sivans from Peloth Prime, gentle herbivores who had recently discovered radio signals, the Brel, a fungal collective, who communicated through spore pattern arrangements and mostly wanted to discuss philosophy, pleasant candidates, predictable candidates. And then, at the very bottom of the list, almost like someone had scribbled it in as an afterthought, humans, planet of origin, Earth, classification, carbon-based bipedal omnivores, homeworld classification, pending review. I remember turning to my colleague Phexa, who handles environmental assessments. She is a gruel, which means she has 4 eyes, 3 stomachs, and approximately 0 patience for nonsense. She looked at the file, blinked all 4 of her eyes in sequence, the gruel equivalent of a deeply uncomfortable laugh, and said, "Vorruk, that planet is a death world." I told her that death worlds, by the Cooperative's official definition, do not exist. Every world capable of producing sentient life falls within survivable parameters for said life. It is basic evolutionary logic. Phexa handed me the atmospheric data. I looked at it. I looked at it for a very long time. Then I very quietly asked her to book me a window seat on the survey vessel, because I had a feeling I was going to need the view to process what I was about to experience. The orientation session was Phexa's idea. Her reasoning was sound. Before we made formal contact with any new species, we typically ran a low-profile cultural observation phase. We would attend a public gathering, observe the species in a natural social context, gather data. Simple, clean, no diplomatic complications. For the humans, she found something called an educational seminar, a public lecture being held at something called a university. According to the translation module, this was an institution where humans sent their young to receive structured knowledge transfer. Perfectly normal, every advanced species had something similar. We disguised ourselves using the Cooperative's standard biological mimicry suits, the kind that make a gruel look like something that might, under poor lighting and with considerable generosity, pass for a large human. My suit was less convincing, but Phexa assured me that humans have remarkably limited perceptual awareness of subtle biological inconsistencies. She was at least correct about that. We sat in the back of a large room filled with young humans, rows of them, arranged in neat lines, facing a single older human at the front, who appeared to be in charge. The lecture was titled, according to the printed material someone had left on our seats, Introduction to Planetary Sciences, Extreme Environments and Human Exploration History. I thought this was going to be a historical overview, a nice calm recounting of how humans had gradually, carefully, over many generations developed the technology to survive in slightly less hospitable conditions than their immediate surroundings. I was not prepared. The lecturer, an older female human with short grey hair and an expression that suggested she had seen many things and found most of them either amusing or exhausting, began by pulling up an image on a large display screen. It was a photograph of a place called the Mariana Trench. She explained, in a very calm voice, that this was the deepest point in their planet's oceans. She explained that the pressure at the bottom was approximately 11,000 meters worth of water pushing down on any object at that location. She explained that the temperature was barely above freezing, the darkness was absolute, and the conditions were, by most definitions, incompatible with unprotected biological survival. Then she explained that humans had gone there, not once, multiple times, with increasingly casual equipment, and that one human had done it alone, in a vehicle roughly the size of a small storage pod, eating sandwiches. I wrote sandwiches in my notes, and then stared at it for several seconds. Phexa leaned over and whispered, very quietly, "It's a food item." I checked. The lecturer moved on. She showed them images of a place called the Sahara, a desert, she said, where surface temperatures during peak solar hours could exceed 70 degrees Celsius, where water sources were so scarce that any creature without significant physiological adaptations would expire within hours, where sandstorms moved fast enough to strip paint from metal surfaces. And this, she said, clicking to the next image, is where some humans choose to run. Run. For sport. Voluntarily. The image showed a line of humans in lightweight clothing, moving across a terrain that looked like the surface of an uninhabitable moon, grinning. Several of them were grinning. One appeared to be eating something while running, and also grinning. I looked at Phexa. Phexa looked at me. Neither of us said anything. The lecture continued. The lecturer talked about something called Mount Everest, the highest point on their planetary surface, where the air was so thin that human respiratory systems could not function without supplemental oxygen equipment, where temperatures dropped to levels that would freeze exposed tissue within minutes, where sudden weather changes could trap a climber with no warning and no possibility of rescue. The first successful summit, she said, clicking through images of frost-covered bipeds in bulky suits, was in 1953. Since then, over 6,000 people have reached the peak. A young human in the front row raised his hand and asked, with what I can only describe as intellectual hunger, how many of them died trying? The lecturer did not flinch. She did not express horror at the question. She said, approximately 310 confirmed deaths on the mountain. The bodies of many of them are still up there. They serve as waypoints for current climbers. The young human wrote this down. Wrote it down. With what appeared to be enthusiasm, I was beginning to feel something I had not felt since my first year in field research. A crawling cellular-level sense that the universe was wider and stranger than anything the Institute had prepared me for. Then the moment happened. The moment that I will be describing in this report in increasingly frantic detail for as long as I hold this position. The lecturer finished her segment on Everest and moved on to a topic she called human thermal tolerance. She pulled up a chart. The chart showed the range of temperatures at which a human body could function, survive, adapt, or expire. It was, in the cooperative standard terms, an extraordinary range, far beyond what most species classified as survivable. She talked about something called hypothermia, about the body's cooling mechanisms, about how humans could regulate their internal temperature through a process of liquid secretion through the skin, something called sweating, that allowed them to function in heat conditions that would kill most mammals. She talked about something called hypothermia, about how the human body responded to cold by prioritizing blood flow to vital organs, shedding heat from the extremities, and entering a state of reduced function that could, under the right circumstances, actually be medically reversed even after the heart had stopped. She talked about how, in documented medical cases, humans had been technically dead, no heartbeat, no brain activity, due to cold exposure, and had been revived hours later with full neurological function. The room was quiet, the young humans were writing notes, and then, from the middle of the room, a hand went up, a young female human. She looked young even by human standards, the kind of young that in most species would indicate a pre-educational developmental stage. She had her hair pulled back in what I later learned is called a ponytail, and she was holding a stylus above her notepad, and she had the expression of someone who had just heard something mildly interesting at a social gathering and wanted a small clarification. Casual. Completely, utterly casual. The lecturer nodded at her, and the girl said in a perfectly conversational tone, "So when they're in that hypothermic state, the technically dead one, can they feel pain, or is the nervous system already shut down?" The room waited. The lecturer said, "The nervous system is effectively offline at that point, no pain signals." The girl nodded, as if this confirmed something she had been privately considering, and wrote something in her notepad. Then she raised her hand again. "Follow-up question," she said. "Is there a way to deliberately induce that state, like as a survival technique in extremely cold environments, or does it always happen involuntarily?" I stopped writing. My stylus hovered above my datapad. Phexa's 4 eyes had gone very wide, because what I was watching in this ordinary room, in this ordinary lecture, was a young human who had just learned that her species could be technically dead and come back to life, asking whether or not that could be weaponized as a survival strategy. She wasn't scared. She wasn't horrified. She was taking notes. The lecturer, to her credit, answered the question with academic thoroughness, explaining that induced therapeutic hypothermia was indeed a medical procedure used in surgery, and that wilderness survival protocols generally advised against voluntary exposure because of the high risk of uncontrolled outcome. The girl nodded again. High risk, she repeated, but not zero success rate. The lecturer paused. No, she agreed slowly, not zero. The girl smiled and wrote something else down. After the lecture ended and the young humans filed out, Phexa and I sat very still in the emptying room for approximately 4 minutes. Then Phexa said, "Vorruk?" I said, "Yes," she said. That child just heard about a fatal survival scenario, and her immediate response was to ask how to do it on purpose. I said, "I noticed." She said, "She is probably 16 years old." I said, "I know." She said, "What do we do with this?" I opened my datapad. I looked at the section of the Cooperative membership evaluation form labeled Species Danger Assessment. It had 7 categories. I had never, in 12 years of field research, marked more than 2 of them, as requires further review. I marked all 7. Then I looked back at the door the young human had walked through, still holding her notepad, still presumably somewhere in this building, writing down questions about how to survive scenarios that should, by every rational biological metric, simply kill things. I opened a new page on my datapad and wrote 1 sentence at the top. It read, "These creatures know exactly what their planet is, and they think it's normal." That night, from the observation pod, I filed a preliminary report to the Institute. I kept it professional. I used precise language and measured terminology. I cited specific observed behaviors and matched them against established frameworks for sentient species evaluation. At the very end, I added a personal note, which is technically outside standard protocol, but which I felt was warranted under the circumstances. It said, "I believe the human classification of their homeworld as a non-death world is not a failure of their scientific assessment. I believe it is a completely accurate reflection of their relationship with their environment. They are not surviving their planet despite its conditions. They have simply decided that the conditions are the baseline, and they are optimizing accordingly. This is either the most impressive thing I have ever documented, or the most terrifying. I am not yet certain which, possibly both." I sent the report. Then I looked out the viewport at the small blue and green sphere turning quietly below us, covered in oceans and storms and deserts and ice, and somewhere down there, in a university building, a 16-year-old girl was writing notes about voluntary hypothermia. I decided I needed something to eat. I also decided that tomorrow I was going to find out who that girl was, because something in the back of my mind, the part that had kept me alive through 12 years of field research by being quietly and persistently correct about things, was telling me, very clearly, that she was not done raising her hand. Her name was Mara Osei. I found this out through entirely non-invasive means. Phexa hacked the university's student registry, which she insists is non-invasive because she did it from orbit and therefore never technically trespassed. I have chosen not to argue this point, because Phexa has 3 stomachs and very little patience, and also because I needed the information. Mara Osei, 18 years old, which meant I had underestimated her by 2 years, which felt important somehow. Enrolled in something called a double major, which the translation module initially rendered as 2 fields of study being pursued simultaneously, and which I initially assumed was a clerical error. It was not a clerical error. She was studying both planetary geology and biomedical engineering at the same time, on purpose, because apparently she had looked at both fields and decided that choosing one was an inefficient use of her time. I stared at her student file for a long moment. Then I forwarded it to the Institute's chief evaluator, a Sulan elder named Vorruk Sel, who had been doing species assessments for longer than my species had had running water, with a note that said simply, "Please see attached. I think you should see this before I continue." Vorruk Sel responded within the hour. His message said, "Continue your observations. Do not make contact, and Vorruk, please remember to eat something. Your biometric readings look terrible." So, we continued. Phexa and I attended 3 more of Mara's lectures over the following cycle. We got better at blending in. Phexa discovered that if she wore something called a large coat and sat near the back, most humans would not look at her twice. I was slightly more conspicuous, but I found that carrying a beverage cup and staring at a handheld device was apparently a universally recognized signal among humans that you wished to be left alone. Several of them walked past me every day without a second glance. The camouflage was not visual, it was behavioral. Humans, I noted in my records, are extraordinarily good at ignoring things that are not immediately relevant to their current task. This is either a sophisticated social adaptation or a significant perceptual vulnerability. Possibly both. I was starting to accept that possibly both was going to be the conclusion of a great many of my observations on this species. The second lecture was about volcanoes, not the history of volcanoes, not the geological theory of volcanoes. This was a lecture in a class called Extreme Environment Field Research Methods, and the professor, a short, broad-shouldered male human named Adio Ferreira, who had the sun-worn skin and relaxed posture of someone who spent most of his time outdoors in conditions that would concern most beings, was explaining the practical logistics of conducting research on active volcanic sites. Active, not dormant, not historical, active as in currently erupting, currently producing rivers of molten rock at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, currently releasing toxic gas clouds that could end a biological entity's function in under 4 minutes. Ferreira showed them photographs. He showed them photographs of humans in protective suits standing close enough to lava flows that the edges of the image were blurred by heat distortion. He showed them photographs of a researcher crouched on a cooling lava shelf, taking samples with a long-handled tool, with a fresh flow visible approximately 12 meters away. He talked about wind direction. He talked about how quickly conditions could change. He talked about the specific types of gases to monitor and the threshold readings at which a researcher should begin moving toward the exit route. Exit route planning, he said, clicking to a diagram that showed a volcano's terrain with several marked paths, is the most important thing you will do before you ever set foot on an active site. You always know where you're going if things change. You always have a secondary route. You always have a tertiary route. A student asked, what if all 3 routes become compromised? Ferreira looked at the student. He had the expression of a person who had been asked this question before, had probably asked it himself once, and had come to a very specific piece with the answer. Then, he said, you improvise, and you move fast. He said it the way someone might say, then you take an alternate road if there's traffic. Calm, practical, mildly inconvenient. Mara, sitting 2 rows ahead of us, wrote something in her notepad. I leaned slightly to the left, trying to read it. Phexa grabbed my arm and pulled me back upright. Don't, she whispered. I just want to see what she wrote, I whispered back. I know exactly what she wrote, Phexa said in the flat tone of someone who has accepted something dreadful, and so do you. She was right, I did. After the lecture, something happened that was not in any observational plan Phexa and I had prepared. Mara stayed behind. Most of the students filed out. Ferreira began gathering his materials from the front of the room. Mara walked down to him, notepad in hand, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had a list and intended to get through all of it. We stayed in our seats in the back. We were, by this point, reasonably good at being invisible, and Ferreira's room had very good acoustics. Mara said, Professor, I had a few follow-up questions. Ferreira looked at her notepad, and said with the resigned warmth of an educator who recognized a specific type of student and had learned to simply accept what was about to happen to his afternoon. Of course you do. Go ahead. She asked him about geothermal venting patterns and whether any current research suggested predictive modeling for eruption shifts within a 6-hour window, which she specified was important for planning sample collection around peak output cycles. He answered, she wrote. She asked him whether the current generation of thermal suits offered enough range of motion for a solo researcher working without a field partner, and whether there were any modification techniques used in practice that hadn't made it into the published literature yet. He answered, she wrote, and then asked a clarifying question about the modification, and then wrote again. She asked him, and this was the one that made Phexa quietly put down her datapad and stare at the ceiling, as if appealing to some higher authority for patience, whether there was an academic argument for conducting volcanic field research during active seismic events, rather than between them, on the basis that active seismic periods actually offered more stable surface readings in certain geological formations, because the movement itself created more consistent data outputs than the chaotic settling patterns in the intermediate periods. Ferreira was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is a genuinely interesting argument. Where did you read that? Mara said, I didn't, I was thinking about it in the shower this morning. Ferreira looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I want you to write that up, properly, with a theoretical framework and citations from the existing seismic literature. Bring it to me next week. Mara said, "Okay," in a tone that suggested she had already been planning to do exactly that. She left. Ferreira stood at the front of his empty room for a moment, staring at the door. Then he said quietly, "To no one in particular, that kid is going to get herself killed or win a major award. Maybe both." I wrote that down. I sent another update to Vorruk Sel that evening. This one was longer. I included the volcanic lecture, the conversation with Ferreira, and a detailed behavioral analysis of Mara specifically, though I also included observations from the broader student group, because I am a professional, and this was supposed to be a species-level assessment. But mostly I wrote about Mara. Vorruk Sel responded the following morning. His message was longer than usual. He wrote, "Vorruk, I have reviewed your reports, and I have shared them with the Cooperative's full evaluation committee. We are in agreement that this species presents a classification challenge that our existing frameworks do not adequately address. The standard sentient species rubric operates on the assumption that a species' relationship with its environment is one of management, that a species becomes sapient partly as a mechanism for reducing environmental risk. Humans do not appear to follow this model. They appear to have developed sapience, and then immediately used it to seek out higher risk situations deliberately. This is unprecedented. We are not certain whether to classify this as a survival advantage or a collective pathology. We are scheduling a formal committee review. In the meantime, Vorruk, do not make direct contact, and please eat something." I ate something. Then I went back to watching Mara. On the fourth day, she found us. Not in any dramatic way, not a confrontation. It was in retrospect entirely characteristic of everything I had observed about her. We were sitting in the university's outdoor common area, a large paved space with seating and what humans call food vendors, observing the general social behaviors of the student population. Phexa was cataloging greeting rituals. I was attempting to decode the logic behind a human social hierarchy game called Where You Choose to Sit for Lunch, which appeared to have extraordinarily complex unspoken rules that the participants seemed to navigate entirely by instinct. Mara sat down across from us, just like that, tray of food, notepad. She sat down, arranged her things, and looked at us with the direct, curious attention of someone who had made a decision and was following through on it without any particular drama. "You've been in 4 of my classes this week," she said. "You don't take notes, you don't talk to anyone, you sit in the back and you watch." Phexa and I said nothing. Mara tilted her head. She looked at Phexa. She looked at me. She looked at the specific way my mimicry suit handled the light around the edge of my collar, which I knew from prior field experience was its weakest point. She said, "I'm not going to cause a problem, I'm just curious." I looked at Phexa. Phexa looked at me. Phexa said very quietly, in our native language, "She already knows." Mara's eyes moved slightly toward Phexa when she spoke, tracking the unfamiliar phoneme patterns. She said, "That's not any language I recognize, and I'm in the linguistics elective." Of course she was. What followed was, technically, a violation of about 6 cooperative observation protocols. I want to state clearly, for the record, that Phexa made the final call. She is senior staff. I simply agreed with her assessment that the situation had evolved beyond standard protocol parameters and required adaptive response. We told Mara enough of the truth to be functional. We were researchers. We were from elsewhere. We were here to observe. We were not a threat. She listened to all of this with her notepad open and her stylus moving. She asked, "How many species are in your organization?" I said, 412 registered members." She wrote that down. She asked, "Are there other researchers from your group currently on Earth?" I said, "No," she said. "So you're the primary contact point?" I said, "Technically, yes." She nodded, wrote something, and then looked up. She said, "Can I ask what you're trying to figure out?" I said carefully, "We are attempting to evaluate whether your species meets the criteria for membership in our organization." She said, "And do we?" I paused. Phexa said, with the flat honesty that is a core Gruel personality trait and occasionally her most endearing quality, "We are not sure you fit any of our existing criteria. You are an unusual case." Mara looked at her. Then she said something that I have written down verbatim in my report and intend to submit as the single most illustrative piece of behavioral data collected during this entire observation period. She said, "Is it the Deathworld thing? Because we know about that classification. It came up in a xenobiology forum about 2 years ago when someone leaked a partial cooperative species index. There's been a whole academic discussion about it. Most of us think it's kind of funny." Phexa's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. I said, "You think it's funny?" Mara said, "I mean, a little bit. It's our home. We just live here." She paused. Then she added, "Though I get why it looks that way from the outside. I've thought about it from an extraterrestrial observational perspective, and yeah, objectively, some of what we do is pretty extreme." She said, extraterrestrial observational perspective. She had thought about it from an extraterrestrial observational perspective. She was 18. We talked for 2 more hours. Mara asked questions the entire time. Careful, precise, well-structured questions that suggested she was building a framework as she went. She asked about the Cooperative's membership process. She asked about the biological range of species currently registered. She asked, with a particular focus that I recognized by now as characteristic of her, about which environments cooperative species found most challenging and what the upper and lower limits of their established comfort ranges were. She was cataloging us. I realized somewhere around the 90-minute mark that I had come here to observe a species, and that species was now observing me back with better questions. When she finally stood to leave, she tucked her notepad under her arm and looked at us both for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you. This was genuinely fascinating." She paused. "Also, your suit is losing cohesion around the left collar seam. There's a light refraction pattern that's been bothering me for 3 days. You might want to get that fixed before you talk to anyone less inclined to be discreet." She walked away across the common area, dodging between tables with the easy movement of someone who had somewhere to be and was already thinking about it. Phexa and I watched her go. After a long moment, Phexa said, "Vorruk." I said, "Yes." She said, "We came here to evaluate whether humans were ready for the cooperative." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think we need to file a report asking whether the cooperative is ready for the humans." I looked at my datapad. I looked at the notes I had taken over the past 4 days. I looked at the door Mara had walked through. Then I opened a new document and began writing the most important report of my 12-year career. At the top I wrote the title. It said, "Preliminary Recommendation Regarding Human Species Membership Application, with specific reference to the case for immediate and unconditional acceptance before they figure out how to get here on their own." I sent it. Vorruk Sel responded in 6 minutes, which was the fastest he had ever responded to anything I had filed. His message said 3 words: "Unanimous. Proceed carefully." I looked out at the campus around me, at the ordinary blue sky of a planet that had spent millions of years trying to kill everything on it, and had instead produced creatures who raised their hands in class to ask better questions about how to survive it. I thought about a girl with a notepad who had found 2 alien researchers in a crowd by the refraction pattern on a suit seam, and had sat down across from them without fear, only curiosity. I thought about what it was going to mean for the cooperative when 412 species finally met the 413th. I thought about Vorruk Sel's 2 words, "Proceed carefully." I closed my datapad, looked at Phexa, and said, "We are going to need more observation time." Phexa said, "Obviously." We both looked at the door Mara had walked through. Neither of us said the part we were both thinking, which was that we were no longer entirely sure who was observing whom.